I'm Christina, 34 years old, working as a financial advisor in Boston. Growing up, I lived in the shadow of my perfect older brother, Adam. Year after year, the comparisons, the belittlement, the emotional abuse from my parents chipped away at my self-worth. But everything changed at that family dinner last year when they desperately needed money. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, let me know where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe to join others who understand what it's like to fight for your own worth in a family that never saw it. I grew up in a quiet tree-lined neighborhood in Westport, Connecticut. Our house was a colonial-style home, with a perfectly manicured lawn that my father Richard insisted on maintaining himself despite his demanding schedule as a corporate lawyer. My mother Diana was the quintessential homemaker. She volunteered at school, hosted dinner parties, and kept our home looking like it belonged in a magazine. And then there was Adam, my brother, 4 years older and seemingly perfect in every possible way. From the earliest age I can remember, Adam was the golden child. He was naturally athletic, excelling, particularly in baseball and swimming. Academics came easily to him too. He was placed in gifted programs by 2nd grade. But perhaps his most powerful gift was his charm. He could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention, making adults laugh and winning over his peers without effort. I still remember the day I brought home my first straight-A report card in 4th grade. My hands trembled with excitement as I handed it to my mother, who glanced at it and said, "That's nice, Christina." Later that same evening, when Adam came home with a B+ in advanced calculus, my parents couldn't stop praising him. B+ in a high school level class as an 8th grader, my father exclaimed, putting the report card on the refrigerator. My report card ended up tucked away in a drawer. That same year, I had practiced for months for my piano recital. I'd chosen a challenging piece by Mozart, spending hours after school perfecting it. Unfortunately, my recital fell on the same day as one of Adam's baseball championship games. My father didn't even come to hear me play. My mother sat in the back row checking her watch repeatedly and whisked me away immediately after my performance so we could catch the second half of Adam's game. When people complimented my playing, my mother smiled tightly and said, "Yes, she practices a lot. Adam has a natural ear for music, though. He just never had the time with all his sports." In 5th grade, I won 2nd place in the county spelling bee. When I called home to share the news, my father's response was swift and cutting. "Adam won 1st place when he was your age. Keep practicing." I remember standing in the school hallway, the payphone receiver cold against my ear, fighting back tears as the other contestants were being congratulated by their families. The only adult who ever seemed to truly see me was my Aunt Maggie, my mother's younger sister. Unlike my mother's polished appearance, Aunt Maggie had wild curly hair and wore colorful clothes. She worked as an art teacher and lived in a small apartment filled with books and paintings. Whenever she visited, she brought me art supplies or books and asked detailed questions about my interests. "You have a beautiful way with words, Christina," she told me once after reading a story I'd written. "You notice things other people miss." But Aunt Maggie's visits were rare bright spots in a childhood, increasingly defined by insecurity and anxiety. I began to internalize the message that I was somehow fundamentally inferior to my brother. I started second-guessing myself, afraid to try new things for fear of failing. If Adam was so naturally brilliant at everything and I was nothing like Adam, then what was the point of trying? The pattern continued relentlessly. At family gatherings, my parents would parade Adam around like a show pony. Adam just made the varsity team as a freshman, they'd boast. Adam's science project was selected for the state competition. If relatives asked about me, it was almost an afterthought, and my parents' responses were always brief before steering the conversation back to Adam's accomplishments. My 10th birthday party stands out in my memory as particularly painful. My parents had invited family, friends, and a few of my classmates. I had been so excited about having a party with a mystery theme, complete with a scavenger hunt I'd helped design. But as the party progressed, I noticed my parents spending more time talking with the other adults about Adam's potential college prospects than paying attention to my celebration. When it came time to cut the cake, my father actually said, "Let's wait for Adam to get back from his soccer game. He should be here for the important part." We waited nearly an hour, the ice cream melting, my friends growing restless, until Adam finally arrived sweaty and triumphant from his game. Only then could I blow out my candles. By the end of elementary school, I had developed a protective shell around myself. I learned to expect nothing, and to find satisfaction in my own quiet achievements. I kept a journal hidden under my mattress, where I wrote stories and poems, creating worlds where people like me mattered. I told myself that someday things would be different. Someday I would find a place where I belonged. But those some days felt very far away as I entered my teenage years, where the comparisons would only grow more painful and explicit. High school brought a whole new level of comparison. Adam was already a legend at Westport High by the time I arrived as a freshman. Teachers would look at my last name on the first day of class and say things like, "Oh, you're Adam Thompson's sister. He was one of our best students." The unspoken question always hung in the air. Would I measure up? The answer in my parents' eyes was always no. When Adam got accepted to Princeton on a partial academic scholarship during my freshman year, it became the defining achievement of our family. My father bought Princeton merchandise and proudly displayed it around the house. My mother joined the Princeton Parents Association even before Adam started attending. For months, every conversation somehow circled back to Princeton and Adam's bright future. Meanwhile, I was discovering my own talents, though they looked nothing like Adam's. While he excelled at team sports and debate club, I found myself drawn to creative writing and surprisingly business and finance. My English teacher, Mrs. Lawson, encouraged my writing, entering one of my short stories in a national competition without telling me. When I won third place, I was stunned and delighted. In my school's Future Business Leaders of America Club, I discovered I had a knack for understanding financial markets and investment strategies. Our faculty advisor, Mr. Perez, told me I had one of the sharpest financial minds he'd encountered in a student. But at home, these interests were dismissed as nice hobbies. When I excitedly told my parents about winning the writing contest, my mother said, "That's lovely, dear. Is there any prize money?" When I explained it was just a certificate and publication in a literary journal, she nodded absently. "Well, keep at it. Maybe someday you can write as a side activity." I still remember the family dinner that happened shortly after I was elected treasurer of the student council. It was a Sunday, and my mother's sister and her husband were visiting along with my grandparents. I'd been waiting for the right moment to share my news, and when there was a lull in conversation, I took a deep breath and announced I have some good news. I was elected treasurer of the student council. Before anyone could respond, my father cut in. "That's nice, Christina, but let's talk about something important. Adam just secured an internship at Goldman Sachs for next summer. As a sophomore at Princeton, the youngest intern they've accepted in years." I can still feel the heat that rushed to my face, as all attention immediately shifted to Adam. My grandfather asked questions about the internship, my mother beamed with pride, and I sat there, fork suspended over my plate, completely forgotten. I caught my Aunt Maggie's sympathetic glance from across the table, but even she didn't interrupt the flow of adulation toward Adam. That night, I cried myself to sleep, but it was also a turning point. Something hardened inside me. I stopped seeking my parents' approval because I realized I would never get it, not in any meaningful way. Instead, I threw myself into my interests with renewed determination. I read everything I could about personal finance, investment strategies, and business management. I started a small investment club at school, convincing 10 classmates to pool $20 each to invest in the stock market. By the end of the year, we had increased our collective investment by 15%. Books became my refuge. I'd spend hours at the public library reading novels that transported me to different worlds and nonfiction that fed my growing interest in finance. I started planning my escape from my family's shadow, researching colleges where I could study business or finance, preferably far from Connecticut. Aunt Maggie became my emotional lifeline during these years. She lived about an hour away in New Haven, and sometimes I'd take the train to visit her on weekends. Her apartment became a sanctuary where I could speak freely about my frustrations and dreams without fear of comparison to Adam. "Your parents are blind," she told me once as we sat drinking tea at her kitchen table. "They've created this narrative about Adam being perfect, and they're sticking to it even when evidence suggests otherwise. But Christina, that's their limitation, not yours. You have gifts they can't see because they're not looking. When my high school graduation finally arrived, I had managed to become valedictorian of my class. I'd also secured a full academic scholarship to the University of Massachusetts for their business program. While it wasn't an Ivy League school like Princeton, UMass had an excellent reputation for business education, and the scholarship meant I wouldn't have to rely on my parents financially. My parents threw a graduation party for me, but it felt more like a social obligation than a celebration. Throughout the afternoon, I overheard my father telling guests, "Yes, Christina did well. Of course, Adam had higher SAT scores and more extracurriculars, but she's found her level." My mother, showing photos of both our graduations to her friends, spent far more time lingering over Adam's Princeton ceremony than my high school achievement. When I announced my decision to attend UMass on scholarship, my parents made little effort to hide their disappointment. "We would have helped you financially if you'd gotten into a better school," my father said, as if I hadn't spent years watching them drain their savings for Adam's education. "UMass Island. Fine. Not Princeton, of course, but it will do for what you want to study." What went unspoken but clearly implied was, "You're not Adam, you never will be. So why should we invest the same in you?" I packed for college with a strange mixture of anxiety and elation. I was finally going to be somewhere where nobody knew Adam, where I wouldn't be constantly measured against his accomplishments. I was terrified but also more hopeful than I had been in years. Maybe, just maybe, I could finally discover who Christina was when she wasn't simply Adam Thompson's less impressive sister. The moment I stepped onto the UMass Amherst campus, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Here, no one knew about Adam. No one had expectations based on my brother's achievements. For the first time in my life, I could just be Christina. I declared a major in finance with a minor in economics, throwing myself into my studies with an intensity that surprised even me. Without the constant comparison to Adam, I discovered I was actually quite gifted in understanding financial markets, risk assessment, and investment strategies. My professors noticed. "You have a natural intuition for this," my financial analysis professor told me after I aced his notoriously difficult midterm exam. But college wasn't just about academics for me. It was about finding myself and building genuine connections. During freshman orientation, I met Jessica, a vibrant psychology major from Chicago, with an infectious laugh and boundless energy. In my macroeconomics class, I bonded with Michael, a thoughtful, soft-spoken guy from Vermont, who shared my passion for financial literacy. They became my first real people who liked me for me, not as an extension or comparison to someone else. "You're so different when you're away from your family," Jessica observed during our sophomore year. "When you came back from Thanksgiving break, it was like watching someone shrink, but here you shine." She was right. Every trip home was like stepping back into a cage I'd temporarily escaped. The comparisons never stopped. "Adam's been promoted already," my mother would say over dinner. "His boss says he's on the fast track to management." Or my father would comment, "Adam and Melissa are looking at condos in Manhattan." At 24, remarkable. Meanwhile, my own achievements were met with muted acknowledgement at best. When I was selected for a competitive summer internship at a financial firm in Boston after my sophomore year, my father's response was, "Well, Boston's not New York, but it's something." That internship changed my life. I worked under Sandra Martinez, a senior financial advisor who took me under her wing. Unlike my parents, Sandra saw potential in me. She assigned me meaningful work, gave constructive feedback, and invited me to sit in on client meetings to observe. "You have a gift for translating complex financial concepts into language clients can understand," she told me. "That's rare and valuable." By the end of the summer, Sandra offered me a part-time remote position I could work during the school year and guaranteed me a spot after graduation if I wanted it. For the first time, I felt truly valued for my abilities. While my star was rising, Adam's was beginning to fade, though my parents either didn't notice or refused to acknowledge it. He'd landed a prestigious position at a Wall Street firm after Princeton, but the work culture was taking its toll. During one rare phone call with him during my junior year, he sounded exhausted and stressed. "It's not what I expected," he admitted. "The hours are brutal and the pressure is intense. Some guys are using cocaine just to keep up with the pace." There was a vulnerability in his voice I'd never heard before. You know what's funny, Christina? I've been following some of your investment recommendations from that blog you started. You've got a real talent for this stuff. That conversation was the first time Adam had ever acknowledged my abilities, and it meant more to me than I wanted to admit. It also marked the beginning of a shift in our relationship. 2 months later, he called me in a panic. He'd made some poor investment decisions and was short on his rent. Could I lend him $2,000 until his next bonus? I sent him the money the same day, surprised, and a little unsettled by this reversal in our dynamic. Adam swore me to secrecy. Don't tell Mom and Dad, okay? They think everything's great and I don't want to disappoint them. I graduated summa cum laude from UMass with multiple job offers. I accepted Sandra's offer to join her firm in Boston, excited to start my career in a city I'd grown to love during my internship. At my graduation, my parents attended, but spent most of the ceremony talking about Adam's recent business trip to London. When we went to dinner afterward, my father raised a toast to Christina, starting her career. Good for you, honey. Of course, it's nothing like Adam's first job on Wall Street, but we're proud you're finding your way. I smiled tightly and changed the subject, counting the hours until I could return to my apartment and pack for my move to Boston. The next 3 years were transformative. I threw myself into building my career and my life in Boston. I rented a small but charming apartment in Beacon Hill, adopted a cat named Fitzgerald, and quickly established myself at the firm. I developed a specialty in helping young professionals establish solid financial foundations, particularly women who had previously been intimidated by investing. Meanwhile, Adam's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, though my parents remained oblivious. He called me again, this time needing $5,000 to cover credit card debt. He couldn't explain to his fiancée. Again, I helped him, making him promise to seek financial counseling. He agreed but never followed through. During those years, I built a life rich with meaningful friendships, professional achievements, and personal growth. Jessica moved to Boston after graduate school, and we often met for Sunday brunches, where we talked about everything from relationships to career goals. Michael and I remained close, talking regularly, and visiting when his consulting job brought him to Boston. I dated, though cautiously. My family experience had left me with trust issues I was working through. There was Daniel, a kind architect I dated for nearly a year before his job took him to Chicago. Later, Thomas, a literature professor who shared my love of books but ultimately wasn't right for me. Through it all, I was learning who I was outside the shadow of my family's expectations. Externally, I was thriving. I was quickly promoted at work, building a solid client base and reputation. I started teaching financial literacy workshops at community centers on weekends. I was making good money, had wonderful friends, and was creating the life I wanted. But internally, the wound of my family's treatment remained unhealed. Every call home, every holiday visit, every family gathering reopened it. No matter what I achieved in my parents' eyes, I would never measure up to Adam. The irony that Adam was secretly struggling while I was flourishing was not lost on me. But the patterns established in childhood proved remarkably resistant to change, even in the face of contradicting evidence. I was building my own life, but I hadn't yet fully escaped the emotional prison of being not as good as Adam. That would take a confrontation I wasn't yet ready for, but events were already in motion that would make it inevitable. 5 years after college graduation, I had established myself as one of the top financial advisors at our firm. At 27, I was promoted to senior financial advisor, the youngest in the company's history to hold that position. Sandra, now the managing partner, took me out to celebrate. "You know what I love about your approach, Christina?" she said as we clinked glasses. "You don't just manage money, you educate your clients. You give them the tools to understand their finances and make informed decisions. That's why your client retention rate is the highest in the firm." There was a sweet irony in my professional success. Every day, I helped people secure their financial futures, guiding them through investment decisions and retirement planning. Meanwhile, my own family remained blind to my expertise, still viewing me as the lesser sibling despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Adam's life was unraveling rapidly, though my parents either didn't see it or chose not to. He'd lost his job at the Wall Street firm under circumstances he wouldn't discuss. He claimed to be consulting now but was vague about clients or projects. His marriage to Melissa was showing strain, and he'd developed a gambling habit that he tried to hide, but occasionally mentioned to me during late-night phone calls when he needed money or advice. Despite everything I still cared about my brother, our relationship had evolved into something complicated but real. He was the only person who truly understood what it had been like growing up in our family, and now that we were adults away from our parents' direct influence, we'd developed a fragile bond. I tried to help him when I could, offering financial advice and emotional support, though I was careful not to enable his more destructive behaviors. Thanksgiving that year brought the simmering family tensions closer to the surface. I flew back to Connecticut, bracing myself for the usual comparisons and dismissals. The moment I walked through the door of my childhood home, I could feel something was off. The house looked slightly shabby with repairs clearly delayed. My father's car in the driveway was the same one he'd been driving for years, unusual for a man who typically upgraded every 3 years. At dinner, my parents maintained the fiction of Adam's success with almost desperate intensity. Adam's consulting business is taking off, my father announced to the table, which included Aunt Maggie and her new husband. He's being very selective about his clients, only taking the high-profile ones. I caught Adam's eye across the table and saw him quickly look away, a flush creeping up his neck. Later, when we were alone in the kitchen, he whispered, "Thanks for not saying anything. Things are going to turn around soon, I can feel it." The next day, Aunt Maggie invited me for coffee at her favorite local cafe. As always, she cut straight to the truth. "Your parents are in financial trouble," she said quietly. "Richard's law firm has been losing clients to younger, more tech-savvy firms. They've remortgaged the house twice. And they've been giving money to Adam, a lot of it." "How much?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Enough to seriously deplete their retirement savings," she replied. "Your mother let it slip last month when she'd had too much wine. She thinks I don't understand finances enough to realize how bad it island." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "They're still treating you like you're somehow less than Adam, aren't they? Even now?" I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "It's not right, Christina. It never was." During Christmas visit, a month later, I overheard my mother on the phone with a relative. "If only Christina had Adam's ambition," she said. "She's doing fine with her little job in Boston, but nothing like what Adam has accomplished." I stood frozen in the hallway, a wrapped present in my hands as the irony of her words crashed over me. I was supporting myself completely, had been promoted multiple times, and had a growing investment portfolio. Adam was essentially unemployed, in debt, and regularly borrowing money from our parents. Yet in her mind, he was still the successful one, and I was still coming up short. I managed to maintain my composure through the holidays, but the emotional toll was immense. I returned to Boston feeling drained and angry, questioning why I continued to subject myself to their dismissal and comparisons. In February, my father had a health scare, a minor heart attack that required hospitalization. I immediately flew back to Connecticut. At the hospital, my mother was frantic, not just with worry for my father, but about the medical bills. "The insurance won't cover all of it," she fretted in the waiting room. "And with everything else, I just don't know how we'll manage." "I can help," I offered quietly. My mother looked at me with surprise, as if she'd forgotten I might have resources of my own. "That's thoughtful, Christina. But it's a substantial amount. Nothing compared to what Adam would do if he could right now, of course, but he's in between projects." I bit my tongue and simply nodded. When the bills came, I paid $12,000 of my father's medical expenses, not covered by insurance. My parents acknowledged it with a brief thank you note that mentioned how generous Adam had always been and would be again once his temporary setback was resolved. Adam himself was completely absent during the family crisis. He called with excuses about important meetings and work commitments, but I suspected he was avoiding facing our parents in their time of need, knowing he couldn't help financially. As spring approached, the tension continued to build. My parents were clearly struggling financially, but refused to discuss it openly. Adam was increasingly erratic in his communication, sometimes calling me multiple times in 1 week, then disappearing for weeks at a time. And I was growing increasingly resentful of the persistent fiction my parents maintained about our respective successes and failures. Something had to give. I just didn't realize how soon and how dramatically the breaking point would arrive. June brought my father's 65th birthday. Despite their financial troubles, my mother insisted on hosting a gathering at their home. Just family and a few close friends, she said when she called to invite me. And please don't mention anything about our situation. Your father is sensitive about it. I arrived the day before the party to help with preparations. The house I grew up in felt like a museum dedicated to Adam's achievements. His trophies still lined the shelves in the den. His Princeton diploma hung prominently in the hallway. Photos of him dominated the living room walls, while the few of me were tucked away on side tables or bookshelves. As I helped my mother prepare food for the party, she talked incessantly about Adam. He's bringing his new girlfriend. She works in fashion, very connected. This could be the one after that disaster with Melissa. She lowered her voice. Though, of course, that wasn't his fault. She just couldn't handle the demands of his career. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I knew the real reason for Adam and Melissa's divorce was his gambling and financial deception. But my mother had created an alternate reality where Adam was the wronged party. The day of the party arrived sunny and warm. Guests began arriving in the afternoon, my father greeting them with forced joviality that didn't quite reach his eyes. Adam was predictably late, arriving 2 hours after the party started, with a stunning woman named Natalie on his arm. He brought an expensive bottle of scotch for our father, though I wondered if he'd put it on a credit card he couldn't pay off. From the outside, Adam still looked the part of the successful businessman. Designer suit, expensive watch, confident smile. But I could see the cracks in the facade. The watch was the same one he'd had for years. The suit showed signs of wear at the cuffs, and his eyes held a desperate, hunted look when he thought no one was watching. Dinner was served in the backyard, the table decorated with my mother's best china and crystal. As we ate, the conversation flowed around safe topics, neighborhood news, an upcoming local election, summer vacation plans. Adam dominated the conversation, as always telling slightly exaggerated stories that cast him in a flattering light. Our parents beamed at him, interjecting occasionally to highlight some particularly impressive aspect of his tales. It was Aunt Maggie who disrupted the careful performance. "Christina," she said during a lull in conversation, "tell everyone about your promotion and that industry award you received. What was it called again?" All eyes turned to me, and I felt my cheeks warm. "Oh, it's not a big deal. Just the Rising Star in Financial Advising Award from the Financial Planning Association." "Not a big deal," Aunt Maggie pressed. "Didn't you say it's usually given to people with at least 10 years in the industry, and you got it after only 5? Before I could respond, my father cut in. "That's nice, Christina. Speaking of careers, Adam, tell us more about that potential partnership you mentioned." The moment passed, but I caught several guests exchanging glances. The contrast between my parents' dismissal of my achievement and their fawning interest in Adam's vague potential partnership was obvious to everyone. After dinner, as coffee and dessert were being served, my father clinked his glass for attention. His face looked suddenly older, the lines around his mouth deeper than I remembered. "Diana and I have an announcement," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "As some of you know, the legal profession has been changing, and my firm has faced some challenges in recent years." He cleared his throat. "The short version is that we're facing some financial difficulties. We've made the decision to sell this house." A murmur went around the table. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "We've lived here for 35 years, she said. "Raised our children here. But we simply can't afford to keep it anymore." "What happened to your retirement savings?" someone asked. My father and mother exchanged a look. "We've had some unexpected expenses," my father said vaguely. "And we've been helping Adam through some temporary setbacks in his career. The kind of high-level work he does has natural ebbs and flows." Adam studied his plate intensely, not meeting anyone's eyes. Then my father turned to me, his expression a strange mixture of reluctance and expectation. "Christina, we know you've been doing adequately in your career, and we would never ask if we weren't in a difficult position." My stomach tightened. I knew what was coming. "We need $50,000 to avoid foreclosure while we prepare to sell the house," he continued. We know it's not much compared to what your brother would do if he could right now, but we're hoping you might be able to help." The table fell silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, including Adam's now. He looked panicked, knowing that I understood exactly why he couldn't help our parents. But it was my mother's next words that finally broke something inside me. "If only you were more like your brother," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "You'd understand the importance of family. Adam has always given so generously when he could." I sat perfectly still, feeling a strange calm settle over me. 30 years of being compared unfavorably to Adam, of having my achievements dismissed, of being made to feel perpetually inadequate despite all evidence to the contrary, crystallized in that moment into perfect clarity. I looked at Adam, who couldn't meet my eyes. I looked at my parents, who genuinely seemed to believe that I was the disappointment even now. I looked at the guests, uncomfortable witnesses to this family drama. And I made a decision. The time for silence was over. The silence stretched at the table as everyone waited for my response. I took a slow sip of water, organizing my thoughts. When I spoke, my voice was calm and clear. "I find it interesting that you're asking me for money while simultaneously suggesting I don't measure up to Adam," I began. "Let's talk about that for a moment." My father shifted uncomfortably. "Christina, this isn't the time or place." "Actually, I think it's exactly the time and place," I countered. "You've spent my entire life comparing me unfavorably to Adam in front of others. Why stop now when there's an audience?" I turned to address the table at large. "Would you all like to know the truth about how well Adam and I are actually doing?" Christina. Adam warned, his face pale. "I'm 29 years old," I continued. "I'm a senior financial advisor at Martinez Partners in Boston. Last year, I managed over $30 million in client assets and earned a six-figure income. I own my apartment outright, have zero debt, and have a diversified investment portfolio currently valued at just over $300,000. My parents stared at me, clearly shocked by these specifics about my financial situation that I'd never shared before. Adam, on the other hand, I continued, turning to my brother, hasn't held a steady job in over 2 years. His consulting business consists primarily of sporadic project work and unsuccessful attempts to trade stocks. He has approximately $70,000 in credit card debt, a gambling problem he's been hiding from you, and has been borrowing money from me periodically for the past 3 years. Adam's girlfriend, Natalie, turned to him with wide eyes. "Is this true?" He couldn't respond, his face a mask of shame and anger. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. "I've brought records of the money I've lent to Adam, as well as the $12,000 I paid for Dad's medical bills in February. Money that was acknowledged with a thank you note reminding me how generous Adam would be once his temporary setback was resolved." I placed the folder on the table. "I've been supporting both Adam and indirectly you for years, while you continued to treat me as if I was somehow failing to measure up." My mother's face had gone white. "We didn't know." "You didn't want to know," I corrected. "It didn't fit the narrative you created, where Adam is the golden child and I'm the disappointment. You've been so committed to that story that you've ignored all evidence to the contrary." I turned to face my father directly. "Do you remember my college graduation? I graduated summa cum laude with multiple job offers. Your toast that night was, and I quote, 'to Christina starting her career.' Good for you, honey. Of course, it's nothing like Adam's first job on Wall Street, but we're proud you're finding your way." My father had the grace to look embarrassed. "I didn't mean it like that." "Yes, you did," I said quietly. "You've meant it like that my entire life. When I got straight, as in elementary school when I was valedictorian, when I won that national writing contest, when I got a full scholarship to college, when I was promoted, when I won that industry award Aunt Maggie mentioned earlier. Every single achievement of mine has been dismissed or diminished in comparison to Adam." I could see the defensive arguments forming on my parents' faces, the habitual dismissal of my perspective. "Before you say I'm exaggerating or being too sensitive," I continued, "let me remind you of what happened literally 10 minutes ago. I mentioned receiving a prestigious industry award usually given to people with twice my experience. And Dad, you immediately changed the subject to Adam's non-existent potential partnership." Several guests nodded, having witnessed this themselves. "And now," I said, my voice growing stronger, "now you need $50,000 and suddenly I'm worth talking to." Suddenly, my adequate career might be useful to you. But even in asking for my help, you couldn't resist comparing me unfavorably to Adam, who hasn't been able to help himself, let alone you for years. Adam finally spoke, his voice rough. It's true, he admitted. All of it. I lost my job at Manning & Reed because I was using company funds to cover gambling debts. The consulting business is barely keeping me afloat. Christina has bailed me out multiple times when I was desperate. He looked at our parents. She's been more successful than I ever was, but you never saw it because you were so fixated on the image of me being perfect. My mother began to cry. My father looked stunned, as if the foundations of his world were crumbling. I reached the moment I'd been building toward, the words I'd held back for decades, finally finding their way out. You've always told me I'll never be as good as Adam, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. So why don't you ask him to pay for your mortgage? Oh wait, he can't because he's broke. I've been supporting him while you've been praising him. The silence that followed was absolute. My Aunt Maggie reached over and squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes, but pride on her face. My father was the first to recover. You don't understand the pressure Adam was under. He began falling back on his habit of defending Adam at all costs. If you'd been held to the same standards he was. I cut him off with a short, incredulous laugh. That's your response. After everything I just said, you're still making excuses for him and blaming me. This is exactly the problem. Diana, Richard, Aunt Maggie interjected. Listen to yourselves. Your daughter has just told you she's extraordinarily successful, while your son has been struggling with addiction and financial problems. And your instinct is still to defend him and criticize her. Can't you see what you're doing? My mother wiped her eyes. We never meant to hurt you, Christina. We just wanted what was best for both of you. No, I said firmly. You wanted what was best for Adam. I was an afterthought. And the saddest part is that your favoritism didn't even help him. It enabled him to avoid consequences and responsibility until it nearly destroyed him. I stood up suddenly, needing space from this table, this house, the weight of decades of emotional neglect. I'll help you, I said, looking at my parents. But I have conditions. First, we all start family therapy together. Second, you really acknowledge the favoritism and the damage it's done to both me and Adam. And third, there will be a plan for financial independence going forward, not endless bailouts. I turned to Adam, and you. If you want my help, you get professional help for your gambling. You start being honest with everyone, including yourself. No more lies, no more pretending. Without waiting for a response, I walked away from the table, through the house, and out the front door. I sat on the front steps, breathing in the warm summer air, feeling lighter than I had in years. The door opened behind me, and Aunt Maggie sat beside me. I've waited 30 years for you to say those things, she said softly. I should have said them sooner. You said them exactly when you were ready, when you were strong enough to stand in your truth, regardless of their response. She put her arm around me. I'm so proud of you, Christina. Not just for your success, but for your courage. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes before I heard the front door open again. I steeled myself, expecting my parents. But it was Adam who sat down on my other side. You just blew up their whole world, he said, but there was no anger in his voice. And mine too, I guess. It needed blowing up, I replied, for all our sakes. He nodded slowly. I've known for years that they treated you unfairly. I should have said something. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. It was easier not to. Their expectations for me were crushing, but their approval was addictive. I didn't want to lose it. He looked at me directly. I'm sorry, Christina, for letting it happen, for taking advantage of you, for everything. It wasn't a complete resolution, not by any means. There would be hard conversations ahead, boundaries to establish, trust to rebuild, or, in some cases, build for the first time. But as I sat there between my aunt and my brother, I felt something I hadn't felt in my family's presence for a very long time: hope. I stood up, brushing off my dress. I'm going to get a hotel room for tonight. I need some space to process. Adam nodded. What about Mom and Dad and the money? I meant what I said. I'll help them, but only with those conditions. The choice is theirs. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight of decades of seeking approval and validation finally begin to lift. For the first time in my life, I had spoken my truth to my family regardless of their reaction. I had stood firm in my own worth, not as a comparison to anyone else, but as myself, Christina Thompson, complete and sufficient. It was the most liberating feeling in the world. The aftermath of that explosive dinner was both messy and necessary. I checked into a hotel that night emotionally exhausted but oddly peaceful. The next morning, I received separate text messages from both my parents asking to talk. I agreed to meet them for lunch at a neutral location, a cafe in town. The conversation was difficult. My father, always the family patriarch, struggled visibly with the shift in our dynamic. He vacillated between defensiveness. We always supported both of you, and grudging acknowledgement. Perhaps we were harder on you than Adam. My mother cried, insisting they had only ever wanted the best for both of us. I remained calm, but firm. I'm not here to punish you, I explained. But I won't pretend anymore. If we're going to have a relationship moving forward, it has to be based on truth and mutual respect. They agreed with varying degrees of reluctance to my conditions. I transferred $25,000 to their account that day, enough to prevent immediate foreclosure while they prepared to sell the house. The rest would come when they started therapy and demonstrated real commitment to change. Back in Boston, I processed the confrontation with help from my closest friends. Jessica came over the night I returned, bringing wine and takeout. I can't believe you finally said all that, she marveled as I recounted the dinner. How does it feel? Like I've put down a weight I've been carrying since childhood, I admitted. But also scary. I've never had a relationship with my parents that wasn't defined by their comparison of me to Adam. I don't know what comes next. Michael, ever practical, helped me set up clear financial boundaries. You need to document everything, he advised during one of our regular calls. Love them, help them, if you choose to, but protect yourself. I found my own therapist, Dr. Eleanor Winters, who specialized in family dynamics and childhood emotional neglect. Our weekly sessions became a cornerstone of my healing process. What your parents did is called golden child divided by scapegoat dynamics, she explained. It's a form of family dysfunction that damages both children, though, in different ways. Adam was given impossible standards to uphold and conditional love based on achievement. You were denied validation and recognition regardless of achievement. Understanding the psychological framework helped me see that my parents' behavior wasn't simply personal cruelty but a dysfunctional pattern they likely inherited from their own upbringings. It didn't excuse their actions, but it helped me contextualize them. My father was initially resistant to therapy, attending the first family session with crossed arms and a skeptical expression, but the therapist, Dr. Marquez, was skilled at breaking through defenses. Richard, he said, after listening to my father, minimize the impact of their parenting. If a colleague treated one of his children the way you've treated Christina, what would you think of him? The question landed like a stone in still water. My father's certainty visibly faltered. My mother's journey to understanding was emotional and tearful. 3 months after the confrontation, she called me sobbing. I've been reading about favoritism in families, she said, and watching our old home videos. I could see it, Christina. The way we focused on Adam, the way we dismissed you. How did I not see it for all those years? It was the first genuine acknowledgement she'd made, and though it was just a beginning, it meant everything to me. Adam's path was perhaps the most difficult. He finally admitted to his gambling addiction and entered a recovery program. He moved to a smaller apartment, took a steady job below his qualifications to stabilize his finances, and began the long process of rebuilding his life without the cushion of being the family's golden child. Our relationship transformed too. Without the toxic dynamic of comparison, we discovered we actually liked each other. Adam had a wry sense of humor I'd never fully appreciated, and he expressed genuine interest in my work and life. You know what's ironic, he said, during a weekend visit to Boston about 6 months after the confrontation. I spent years being jealous of your freedom. Everyone expected me to be perfect to follow this specific path to success. No one cared what you did, So you gotta figure out what you actually wanted. You built a life that fits you. I'd never considered that perspective before, that there had been a cost to being the favored child, too. The first family therapy session was painful but necessary. Dr. Marquez created a safe space for us to express long-buried feelings. I spoke about the countless moments of feeling invisible and inadequate. Adam talked about the crushing pressure of being placed on a pedestal. Our parents really listened, many for the first time. It wasn't an instant fix. There were setbacks and old patterns that emerged, particularly during times of stress. But slowly, incrementally, things changed. 1 year after the confrontation, we had dinner together at my parents' new home, a modest condo they'd purchased after selling our childhood house. The conversation flowed more naturally than it ever had. My mother asked detailed questions about my work, showing genuine interest. My father, still more reserved, nevertheless made a point of mentioning an article about financial advising he'd read, saying it had made him think of me. Small steps, but meaningful ones. My professional success continued to grow. I was now managing my own division at the firm, specializing in helping women achieve financial independence. Sandra was talking about a partnership track in my future. I'd also started writing a book about financial literacy for young adults, drawing on my workshops and client experiences. But the most profound changes were internal. I no longer measured my worth against anyone else's expectations or achievements. I'd finally internalized what Aunt Maggie had tried to tell me for years, that my value was inherent, not comparative. This newfound self-assurance affected all areas of my life. I became more confident in my relationships, more authentic in my friendships, more decisive in my career. I started dating Lucas, a kind and thoughtful architect I met through a client, and for the first time, I entered a relationship without the baggage of feeling fundamentally inadequate. Aunt Maggie remained my steadfast supporter and confidante. "You've always been extraordinary, Christina," she told me. "The difference is that now you know it too." Perhaps the most powerful moment of my healing journey came when I was working with a new client, a young woman named Sophia, who had just received a significant inheritance. As we discussed her financial goals, she mentioned offhandedly that she always felt she needed to prove herself because her parents favored her sister. "I know it shouldn't matter anymore," she said, embarrassed. "I'm 32 years old. But somehow, it still does." I looked at her with deep understanding. "It matters because it shaped how you see yourself," I said gently. "But here's what took me years to learn. Your worth isn't determined by comparison to anyone else. Not your sister, not your colleagues, not some arbitrary standard of success." As I spoke these words to Sophia, I realized how completely I had come to believe them for myself. The healing wasn't just intellectual understanding, but emotional integration. I had finally truly stepped out of the shadow of being Adam's less impressive sister, and into the light of being fully, authentically Christina. The journey wasn't over, of course. Family dynamics don't transform overnight, and old wounds leave scars that can still be tender. But I had found my voice, established my boundaries, and claimed my place not as better or worse than my brother, but as myself, unique and sufficient. The moment I stopped trying to be as good as my brother was when I finally became myself. And that turned out to be more than enough. Have you ever been compared to a sibling or friend in a way that made you feel invisible? Share your experience in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to support more stories about finding your worth in a world that sometimes fails to see it. Remember, your value isn't determined by comparison to anyone else, but by the unique gifts only you can bring to the world. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I hope it helps you embrace your own.